two of New Zealand's most eminent artists, Louise Henderson and Marty Friedlander, and the architects who designed the spaces they inhabited, and to some extent these spaces. Louise Henderson and Marty Friedlander were from different eras and completely different worlds, but in a way they had similar experiences. And although they appear to have felt them in different ways, these experiences enabled them to deliver a wealth of important and memorable work in New Zealand. They did not fit in with society's idea of the norm, but rather carved out a life for themselves that gave them an identity and freedom at a time when women lacked just that. They rejected the idea of what was expected of them in a traditional sense and pursued their own interests and passions. Louise's story is truly one of an artistic journey. It begins in Paris, where she was born in 1902. Louise was exposed to the art world as a child, spending time in sculptor Auguste Rodin's studio, where her father worked as Rodin's secretary. Developing a passion for painting, Louise was denied access to art school by her parents, who deemed it an unsavory vocation for a young Parisian woman. Instead, she studied embroidery and textile design, which was considered a much more acceptable craft. As a graduate, she worked for a magazine called Madame to draw blueprints and write articles on embroidery and interior design. As a young student in 1920, Louise had a chance encounter at an art exhibition in Paris. Her life was about to change. It was at this exhibition that she met a young New Zealand man, Hubert Henderson. They fell in love. Hubert had served in Europe during World War I in the New Zealand Expeditionary Force, and following the war attended Cambridge University. An intellectual mind and an interest in art enabled Hubert to understand and respect Louise's passions and ambitions. After returning to New Zealand in 1923 and taking up a position as an assistant master at Christchurch Boys High School, Hubert proposed to Louise in writing, and she accepted. She needed to satisfy her parents, however, that if she was going to travel alone to New Zealand, she would not be a single woman. And to respect her parents' sensibilities and views of respectability, Hubert and Louise were married by proxy in 1925. What happened next? In her own words, Louise has described her arrival in New Zealand as being like opening a door for me, she said. I discovered things I never knew existed. It was a new world. Louise was free of the rules and constraints laid down for her by her parents. New Zealand, she said, was like a dream country. I was free, I could paint. She began painting immediately. Inspired and influenced by her exposure to European modernism, Louise painted local landscapes and buildings, making reference to the European modern artists such as Monet, Cézanne, Picasso and Braque. These works depicted her new world that was so different to the Parisian streets and boulevards that she was used to. Louise described the Christchurch she came to as being a cultured place, but she also described it as being dull. Louise embraced her new world. She began studying at the Canterbury College School of Art while teaching embroidery and design there. Later, she was to be awarded an honorary diploma in fine arts from the University of New Zealand for her work at the college. Louise became an early member of a radical association of young artists in Christchurch called The Group, which had formed in 1927 as a reaction to the very conservative Canterbury Society of Arts. Other members included Rita Angus, Tom Williston, Niall Marsh, Olivia Spencer-Brown, and later Colin McCann. The group held art exhibitions enabling Louise to show her work. Amidst all of this, Louise gave birth to her only child, Diane, in 1933. And then what appears to be typical of Louise's energetic character, 10 days later, she exhibited 7 of her paintings with the first exhibition of the New Zealand Society of Artists. She was great friends with Rita Angus, and the two women often travelled around Canterbury countryside on painting trips. These are two of the works that she produced from those trips. There were many more, of course. She was incredibly prolific. Never idle. Louise also found time to teach art at Rangiora High School, part-time, in the late 1930s. The Hendersons moved to Wellington around 1940. Louise took up employment teaching needlework for the New Zealand Correspondence School. Setting up a new curriculum for embroidery lessons, she embraced not only the traditions and techniques of embroidery, but also took a more creative approach to embroidery patterns, introducing new geometric designs. Simultaneously, Louise found time to study for a Bachelor of Arts at the Victoria University College. Although she had little time to paint during these war years, Louise still managed to produce new work for her first solo exhibition in 1948 in the Wellington Public Library. It was around this time Louise began corresponding with Auckland Cubist painter John Weeks, and under his guidance, her painting style, forever evolving, changed direction. She now embraced Cubism. In 1950, Louise, Hubert and Diane moved to Auckland when Hubert was appointed as Auckland's first superintendent of education. They bought a two-storey arts and crafts style house in Gillies Avenue on a large block of land set in native bush. The Hendersons lived on the ground floor apartment of the house, which had already been converted into 3 flats in 1947. They rented out the other 2 flats. The apartments were to provide an income for Louise should anything happen to Hubert. It was in Auckland that Louise began to paint full-time. No longer employed, she began painting in the studio of her friend John Weeks. Then the Hendersons erected a studio on the property at the rear of the house. This was Louise's first studio. Built to Louise's specifications, it is a weatherboard-clad, small box-like structure with a flat roof. Louise stipulated that she only wanted south-facing windows to avoid the harsh northern lights. You can see the windows here. And it's a very dark room, as you can see. So she was able to produce the colour that she wanted to produce. In the studio, her energy was inexhaustible. Sorry, going a bit further than I was expecting to. She produced and produced and produced. Shows for her new work were held in Auckland, Hamilton and Wellington as early as 1950 to 1951. And then Louise was asked to show her work at an exhibition at the Irving Galleries in London called 15 New Zealand Painters. This was alongside her friends Rita Angus and Colin McCann, amongst others. Louise's early abstract work received excellent reviews. Her painting Still Life in Arum Lilies was shown at the exhibition. A critic said the painting was like bringing flowers to the verge of abstraction with skill and taste. Louise was identified as having the most style of them all, meaning the other painters, and a sensitive, intelligent brain behind her strokes. Louise was finally recognised as one of New Zealand's foremost painters. Around this time, Louise wrote to John Weeks, saying, "I am ever so bored in this country. It is so dull. Forgive this. You are, of course, a cosmopolitan, and shall understand what I mean." Louise looked to return to Paris for a while for both inspiration and a more stimulating life. In 1952, she was accepted as a student in Cubist artist Jean Messinger's studio in Paris. And so at the age of 50, Louise embarked on a new journey to live a year in Paris, developing her Cubist style under the guidance of this internationally acclaimed artist. After arriving back in New Zealand in 1953, Louise returned to her studio with fresh vision, expressing the female image in an abstract form and developing her colourful Cubist style. With this work, Louise became the first New Zealand contemporary artist to hold a solo exhibition at the Auckland Art Gallery. One of the paintings she returned to New Zealand with was that of a nude woman called Woman in Blue. The nudity of the woman was deemed as being too offensive for a conservative New Zealand audience, despite its cubist form. Louise drew a veil over the body so that the painting could be included in the exhibition. She was described in a review of the New Zealand Herald as a serious and significant painter working in the cubist form. In an article published in Home and Building in 1954 by Colin McCann praises the exhibition. This is actually a study sketch of Woman in Blue. I couldn't find a painting. I'm not sure whether that is in private ownership, but it would have been quite something, and quite something for her to actually cover it up as well. But it was important to have it in the exhibition. Between 1956 and 1958, Hubert was appointed as an advisor on compulsory education for UNESCO in Beirut. Louise joined Hubert in the Middle East and continued to draw and paint while there. Drawings and paintings capturing her experiences in the Middle East were exhibited in both London and Sydney in 1958. Continually evolving and challenging herself, Louise's work took on different forms. Here she is back in her studio in the late 1950s with her painting House in Dieppe. She designed 3-metre-high stained glass windows for the Church of the Holy Cross in Henderson in 1960, and in 1963 completed a design for a 6-metre-long woven wall mural for the New Zealand room at the Hilton Hotel in Hong Kong. In June 1993, Hubert died. Distraught with grief, Louise packed away her brushes, declaring she would never paint again. However, later that year, she did paint again, throwing her grief into producing the abstract expressionist series, Elements, Air and Water. In the series, she re-engaged with the New Zealand landscape, which had captured her interest when she first arrived in New Zealand, albeit a different style. In 1965, this series was exhibited in Brussels alongside Milan Merkasich's Emblem series. Travelling with the exhibition, Louise remained in Europe for further exhibits in the New Zealand Embassy in Paris and New Zealand House in London. She did not return to New Zealand until 1967. I've already mentioned the studio built for Louise where the Hendersons moved to, and when the Hendersons moved to Auckland. Louise was now outgrowing the studio. It was too confined for the larger scale work she was producing. It was also very inward looking. After returning to New Zealand, Louise took on a new perspective, embracing her surroundings. In an audio interview with Anne Kirker in 1984, she talked about her time in Europe, exclaiming, "I have not seen anything but walls and houses and inside studios. My studio was in the bush in Gillies Avenue. So beautiful, the trees. What else could I do but paint the bush?" Henderson commissioned her friend James Hackshaw to design the new studio addition to be filled with light and engaged with the exterior bush surrounds. At this time, it was unusual to employ an architect to design a studio, possibly because most artists were impoverished, and anything beyond a simple build would have been too expensive for them. I'm just going to have to stop for a minute here because I'm having technical difficulties with my talk. Just bear with me. I will get it up and running again soon. I'm very sorry. Okay. Should be nearly there. Okay, the studio design indicates Louise had specific requirements and wanted something quite special. The plans submitted to council indicate the studio was not completed until 1969. The new studio was attached to the original box studio, and for the purpose of resource consent, it was called a hobby room, as she had already applied to add a studio to the property. The views that were offered from the studio provided new inspiration being set within the trees, reminiscent of the bush setting that provided so much inspiration to Colin McCann and Titirangi. It was unusual that this setting was so close to the city. The design of the studio allowed views of the treetops and provided the subtleties of ever-changing light filtered through the trees. It was in this studio that Louise completed Bush series paintings in the 1970s, which truly reflected her new relationship with nature. This image shows Louise in her studio in the 1970s with the Bush series paintings. The house in Gillies Avenue was sold in 1984 along with the studio, which remains on the property today. The studio continued to be used as an art studio until recently by artist and former student of Louise's, Carla Munson. After remarrying in 1986, Louise continued to paint, and in 1987, at the age of 85, she completed a series of 2.5 metre high canvases for every month of the year, which she called the 12 months. This was done in a makeshift studio in what was then the Farmers Car Park. On entering, so I'm going to talk about the studio now, the hobby room, the new studio. On entering the 1950 studio, the original studio, there is a clear transition from dark to light, passing through the earlier space to the new studio. The transition is quite symbolic of the evolution of Louise's work. Although the two studios are worlds apart in terms of architecture, they are attached and share a relationship with Louise and her work. They have a totally different design aesthetic, one looking inward with no light, while the other looks out on the surrounding trees and embraces light. They have a physical relationship that cannot be ignored. In contrast to the earlier studio, the new design is lightful with angular roof lines reminiscent of John Scott's Fortuna Chapel, allowing for glazing at a high level with triangular clerestory and gable-end windows. The shape of the roof line is clearly expressed on the interior. Romantic versions of Parisian artists' loft studios with sloping roofs and angled corners have almost certainly influenced Hackshaw's concept design. Inspirations gathered in Hackshaw's time in Paris, and possibly a request made by Louise, or maybe paying homage to her Parisian roots, the studio appears to have referenced the traditional Parisian artist lofts with its attic-like ceiling angles and high glazing, while taking on a modern concept, a geometric abstracted version of the traditional loft. There is an entry from the earlier studio with timber stairs leading down to the floor level of the new build. From the exterior, double glazed doors at ground level are reached via stone steps in the garden and behind the house. On the interior, the ridge beam, crossbeam and rafters are exposed. Posts are also exposed and matte floorboards are laid on the floor. The studio was clearly designed to engage directly with the surroundings and to experience the influence of shifting light. Hackshaw's design was to provide an inspirational platform engaging with light and bush that could be captured in brushstrokes. The studio was to be the blank canvas. The architect, James Hackshaw, was born in Mananui, near Taumarunui, in 1926. James Hackshaw attended the Auckland University School of Architecture in 1945, and under the guidance of mentor Vernon Brown, James formed an alliance with other students who shared similar beliefs. They rejected the conventions and conceived an Indigenous architecture which included new ways of functional, affordable houses for spaces based on people's ways of life and needs. As students of architecture, they would have known and devoured the work of earlier 1920s and 30s modernist movement and ideologies from Europe, including such architects as Henry Kolker, along with Le Corbusier, the Barons and the Bauhaus movement, and of course Adolf Loos, all of whom promoted the idea of form following function and more casual, livable interiors being designed to meet people's needs. Hexhaw joined with his fellow students, Brett Penman, Bill Wilson, Campbell Craig, Bruce Rotherham, Alan Wild, and Ivan Juris to form the Group Construction Company in 1949. The focus was on designing and building spec housing. This resulted in the well-known first and second houses built in Hauraki on neighbouring sites in 1949 and 1950 respectively. By 1951, the Group Construction Company was starting to get a larger number of commissions, and they began to concentrate on design. They set up a cooperative and called themselves Group Architects. As designers, they individually took ownership of the designs they produced. They were truly representing their new style of homegrown modernist architecture, exercising the best and most efficient use of space with unpretentious design and materials that were affordable for the everyday New Zealander. In 1952, James took time off, obtaining a government bursary to work and study in Paris. He was there the same year as Louise. It is more than likely their paths had crossed. In her book, The Architect and the Artist, Bridget Hackshaw quotes her father as saying that he didn't do a lot of architecture that year, preferring instead to travel and spend time with sculptors and painters. Hackshaw returned to New Zealand in 1954 with new ideas to incorporate in his work. Having viewed the courtyard buildings in Spain and Italy, he interpreted these in groundbreaking modernist architecture with the design of Tom House in Morningside. Not only exploring central courtyard design, but also he not only explored central courtyard design, but also the use of light through clerestory windows. James Hackshaw left the group in 1958 to set up his own practice. He continued to design progressive residential architecture, including Potter Lencastle's Japanese-inspired house in Titirangi in 1959. His use of exposed post and beam construction featured in most of his designs. Hackshaw was already interested in the way light entered the building and how it reacted with the interior and how it was experienced. He was inspired by some great churches in Europe and was captivated by the use of windows and the light that they produced within the space. He was consistent with his use of pop-up dormers, glazed gable ends, or clerestory windows, allowing new ways for light to enter a domestic space. Working with the Catholic Church, he designed a number of churches and church buildings. He worked on his designs making use of light, following similar principle to his residential designs. During his career, James Hackshaw collaborated with many artists, either on buildings they were also commissioned to work on, such as Paul Dibble and Colin McCann, or in designing houses for them. However, Louise Henderson's was the only artist studio that Hackshaw designed, to my knowledge. James Hackshaw continued to practice into his 70s, working from his home and tutoring at the Auckland School of Architecture. He died in 1999 at the age of 73. Hackshaw's work was pioneering in developing the New Zealand vernacular. He used exposed post and beam construction regularly, as demonstrated in the Henderson studio. His designs also expressed his experimentation with the effects of shifting light on the interior from high glazed windows. The high glazing created an almost ethereal effect with the way the windows allowed light into the interior, similar to the light that enters a church. It appears that Hackshaw was experimenting with light and its effects on interior spaces. Now I'm going to talk about Marty. Marty was one of New Zealand's most significant photographers. Born Martha Gordon in London in 1928, she was the daughter of Jewish refugees who had escaped the anti-Jewish pogroms in Kiev in 1919. At some stage, her father left home and her mother fell very ill. Marty and her sister were bundled off to an orphanage. Her early years in orphanages and in foster care provided Marty with a sense of independence and making her own way in the world very early on. At the age of 14, Marty won a faith scholarship to the Bloomsbury Technical School for Women. Her intention was to study dress design. When she was interviewed for the school, the interviewer suggested she try photography, which maybe at the time was considered a more practical skill. The expectation was that a graduate could become a photographer's assistant. Marty had no real idea that this is something you could do for a job, but took it on knowing that she would need some way of supporting herself. So it was by chance rather than passion at this time in Marty's life that enabled her to embark on this journey. Following graduation, Marty got a scholarship to an art school, the Camberwell School of Arts and Crafts, before she found employment as an assistant for two photographers who shared a studio in London. At first, she worked for Sunday Times photographer Douglas Glass as an enlargement printer. And then she was asked by his studio partner, fashion photographer Gordon Crocker, to help him out. Although she was on a very small wage, she was able to afford her first bedsit. She says in her book, Self-Portrait, that, quote, "The world was her oyster. I remember at this time how lucky I am to be me. From age 16 onwards, nobody told me what to do. I had no parents. I had to make decisions about myself, my direction, and my interests without anyone to dissuade or encourage me." So unlike Louise Henderson, Marty Friedlander's independent and creative life, because of her less than privileged upbringing, began very early on and well before she was able to lay foot on New Zealand soil. Marty's early life was so much the opposite of that of Louise's, in that she had no parental guidance or restrictions and was independent at a very early age. The meeting between Marty and her future husband, Gerard, is also, like Louise Henderson's, one of chance and opportunity. Marty first saw Gerard Friedlander when she spotted him in a photograph album belonging to her New Zealand friend, Roger Benjamin. She exclaimed, "Who is that beautiful man?" Gerard was Roger's very good friend. Gerard was born in Germany and relocated with his family, who were Jewish, at the age of 7 to New Zealand to escape Nazi Germany. Gerard had studied dentistry in New Zealand and in 1956 was in London on his big OE. He was interested in photography and had been the photographer for his university magazine. They finally met in person when Gerard arrived at her bedsit, unannounced, one Friday night. Marty refers to him in Self-Portrait as being unconventional and his own person, which she found endearing qualities that clearly suited her. They fell in love. Within weeks of meeting, and in true avant-garde fashion for the 50s, they were sharing a flat with another couple. Gerard was keen to travel through Europe, and in 1957 they decided to get married so that Marty could travel with him in the same name, which was more acceptable in the 1950s. Sailing to New Zealand in 1958, the couple initially lived in Henderson. Gerard's father had bought a dental surgery for him nearby in Te Atatū South. Marty actually worked as a nurse for quite a while. She said she didn't do it that well. However, after leading an independent, free-spirited, busy life in London, Marty felt isolated and alienated in her new world, which was much more conservative and provincial than what she had become accustomed to. Unlike Louise Henderson, Marty's arrival in New Zealand felt oppressive and stifling. Rather than the freedom that Louise experienced, Marty found herself in a cultural desert, a post-war conservative and conformist society with little freedom for women at that time. Marty was using her camera from time to time, but her first real New Zealand photograph was from a march in 1960. There was a protest. They were protesting against the All Blacks going to South Africa without any Maori players. She captured the banner, "I'm all white, Jack." The photograph was used in a BBC series on rugby. Missing London and her life there, Marty went back in 1961 for 3 months for social revival and to save her sanity. She felt she was losing her confidence and losing herself in her new life in New Zealand. When she returned, she said she and Gerard had begun to make friends with local artists, writers and architects, making her life in Auckland less lonely. Māori had sought comfort in finding like-minded migrants that she could engage with to lessen her sense of isolation. She became great friends with the Czech architect Henry Kolka and his wife Hilda. This is a photo taken by Māori. You can see she's actually still moving when the when the shutter goes. And she's sitting next to Hilda Kolka. Marty's in the middle there. She's sitting next to the Kolka's daughter, who I can't quite remember the name of right now, but that's Hilda Kolka next to Gerard. And Henry Kolka is on the other end. This is quite a well-known photo actually, and it's in Kolka's own home, sitting around the dining hall just beneath his stairs to his home. Still unsettled, Marty and Gerard left New Zealand in 1963 in search of a home elsewhere. They returned to London and then travelled to Israel with a view to settle there. This did not happen, and they were back in New Zealand the following year. Marty had kept a photographic diary of their travels, adding to her steadily growing repertoire of photos. What happened next? When the Friedlanders returned to New Zealand in 1964, Marty began working for herself as a full-time freelance photographer. Gerard was very supportive. Immersing herself in her craft, Marty gained some control of her life, and in doing so, liberated herself from the constraints of what she believed was expected of her as a married woman in New Zealand in the 1950s and 60s. She began seeing New Zealand through the lens. In a talk she gave in 2001, Marty said she was excited by all these new images because it was saying something to me, as she said, quote, "It was saying something to me as a migrant about a country that was not that familiar, which was becoming familiar to me through actually photographing it. What was ordinary to a New Zealander was extraordinary to her." Marty said a New Zealander may not have captured the same imagery and may not have recognised what she called so New Zealand. Marty also recognised that New Zealand was in a bit of a time warp and was unlikely to stay that way forever. Intuitively, she felt the need to capture New Zealand in images before it joined the rest of the world, and capture it she did. Travelling around the country on various commissions, photographing farmers, winemakers, politicians, writers and artists, Marty and Maori, and her famous Moku series, Marty captured New Zealand in its entirety. Marty engaged with her subjects. In 1967, the Friedlanders asked their friend Henry Kolka to design a home for them in Herne Bay, a home that would embrace the cultural life they desired to remain in New Zealand. The house was to include the all-important darkroom for Marty. Their life in this house was consumed with social gatherings with like-minded individuals, providing the life Marty had craved when she first arrived in New Zealand. The book Strangers Arrive suggests the interior arrangement and entertaining area provided the foundation for this improvement in lifestyle for the Friedlanders. In 1972, in collaboration with eminent New Zealand historian Michael King, Marty produced the landmark book Moku, Māori Tattooing in the 20th Century. This was quickly followed by the book Larks in Paradise, New Zealand Portraits in the mid-1970s. Then in 1980, Marty published a collection of photographs called Contemporary New Zealand Painters, which included Louise Henderson, Ralph Haughey, Pat and Jill Hanley, and Rita Angus. Marty was awarded the Companion of New Zealand Order of Merit in 1999 in recognition of his services to photography. In 2001, the Auckland Art Gallery hosted a retrospective exhibition which travelled around New Zealand over the next 3 years. Marty died at the age of 88 in November 2016. She was still working at the time on a series of photographs of Waiheke Island winemakers for a book that was published in 2017. Marty's house. The plans, the drawings show a two-storey house of concrete block and timber construction with the main living spaces allocated to the top floor. These are a little bit hard to see, so this is the best I could get, I'm sorry, but these are from the Architecture Archives at Auckland University. An entry on the northern side of the house, which is here, leads to a timber staircase, which accesses the main living area upstairs. On the ground floor, Marty's darkroom, it's here, can be seen in the plans. A separate one-bedroom apartment here can be a separate one-bedroom apartment, is also located on the southern side of the ground floor. Upstairs and accessed directly from the staircase, which arrives here, is the large sunken lounge, and there is a balcony on the northeastern side of the lounge, providing views from the lounge, and large windows on the eastern side of the house, which provide the morning sun. This is a photo of the house not long after it's finished. I believe they're building a fence there. This photo of the sunken lounge was taken by Marty in 1992 before they sold the house. It shows a seating nook with high windows above it, just here. And so they're facing north, and it allows a private conversation and relaxation area while providing northern light, enhancing the sense of spaciousness. Steps from the lounge lead up to the dining area that looks over the lounge. As you can see in this photo, you can see the changes in ceiling heights in both these photos, along with floor levels. The built-in bench seating in the dining area is a trademark of Colker's designs. The walls of the lounge and the dining area had tower cladding up to the ceiling, while the bedrooms in the house only had timber lining up to a dado level, differentiating between the different spaces. Marty commented that the living spaces were beautiful and that they constituted a congenial and theatrical centerpiece. She also commented that they were, in her opinion, primarily a monument to the architect himself. The Friedlanders lived in the house from 1969 until 1992, which were amongst some of the most productive years of Marty Friedlander's career. The architect Henry Kolker was born in 1900 in Czechoslovakia. He studied architecture at the Vienna Technical University at first, then studied under the supervision of modernist architect Adolf Loos. Adolf Loos was the forerunner of the modern movement in Europe and the most well-known Central European modernist architect at the time. Kolker became Loos's assistant in 1919, and by 1927 they were in partnership in an architectural practice in Vienna. Together, Kolker and Loos devised the round plan, a three-dimensional spatial plan explaining the order and size of living spaces and design based on their function. Changes in ceiling height and floor levels and producing rooms of varying volumes and sizing were all used to represent spaces according to their function. After Loos died in 1933, Kolker continued and expanded the architectural practice. He kept the Vienna office and opened a second office in Czechoslovakia to serve as commissions there. Kolker continued to develop the cubic round plan typology to take into account human needs as well as functionality, striving to provide a positive environment for his clients. With the ideology that space is a function of feeling, the interiors were treated with the utmost importance, while the exterior was less descriptive, in fact, austere, very plain. This is evident in a number of Kolker's designs. One of the best known examples of his work is Villa Cantor, which was designed for a medical doctor and needed to include a functional consulting room along with a family home. The exterior shows a large four-story cubic mass with a very plain plaster-rendered whitewash facade broken up by an irregular arrangement of windows. This villa was a deviation from Kolke's earlier work with Luce. Here he had used larger windows, offering more light into the building. Kolke left Nazi-occupied Austria in 1938 and fled with his family to Czechoslovakia. Eventually, he was able to relocate himself and his family to New Zealand in 1940, following the Nazi occupation of Czechoslovakia. Funnily enough, in January 1940, he wrote that he had no great hopes of a good future as an architect in New Zealand. Nothing could have been less true. He was employed by Fletcher Construction when he arrived here as their chief architect. James Fletcher called him a man of exceptional ability, primarily responsible for the Fletcher office buildings, and you can see one of them here, the beautiful, very European-inspired staircase. He remained with Fletcher's for 20 years. In 1943, Kolke designed his first New Zealand house. It was for his family in Maskell Road, St Heliers. Kolke continued designing domestic spaces with the entrenched philosophy of form following function. But above all, he continued designing houses based on the importance of livability that an interior by use of the round plan design ideology. In his early designs in New Zealand, there is a clear transition from the more vertical cubic form to a more modest dwelling. This was partly necessary due to building restrictions at the time. After the war, the government had imposed limits on house sizes due to a post-war shortage of materials. There was also undoubtedly a response to the New Zealand landscape. In 1948, Kolke designed a house in Karori, Wellington, for fellow Czech immigrants, the Halberstams. A small house of the allowed 1250 square feet, which is roughly 116 square meters. The house size was based on the number of children each family had, and the Halberstams had one. The creosoted weatherboards and white painted timber frames are reminiscent of Vernon Brown's houses. However, as is pointed out in the book Modern, Kolke had been using these materials and finishings for years, since at least the 1920s in Europe. As in his European designs, it is the interior of Halberstam House where the unique nature of Kolke's designs come into play. Planning of this house permits the sun in while providing views from the living area. Veneer linings and built-in furniture, including bookcases, a desk, window seats, dining benches, and bedroom cabinetry, are all characteristic of Kolke's design. The built-in furniture makes efficient use of available floor space and provides a level of comfort and sophistication based on the client's lifestyle and needs. There were over 50 houses designed by Kolke within New Zealand, most of them in Auckland. By the 1960s, his design philosophy had shifted a little, less emphasis on the interior, but still psychological changes with the use of seating heights and floor levels and room sizes, according to the levels of importance. Marty and Gerard's house is evident of this, and there were clearly no post-war constraints on their design. Still working at the time of his death in 1971, Kolke produced a number of domestic designs, particularly in the last decade of his life. Kolke's work has more recently been rediscovered in Europe, has been historically significant in the development of modern architecture. The 1934 Czech Villa Kantor has been restored and is now owned and protected by the local government. In summary, I have talked about these two women and their architects, but there is also the element of the husbands of these two women. Both Hubert and Gerard were unconventional, liberal freethinkers, enabling and encouraging Louise and Marty the creative freedom they needed to be who they were. They brought them to New Zealand, providing these two women with the impetus they needed for their work. Marriage in both the 1920s and 1950s would normally have had more conventional outcomes, but both Louise and eventually Marty found new freedoms because of their marriage. Both women expressed their gratitude. Louise said, "God sent me this beautiful wonderful New Zealander to marry." In her biography, Self-Portrait, Marty said, "I've been here more than half of my life now. I don't feel homesick anymore. I love living in New Zealand. It was such good fortune for Gerard that Gerard brought me here. It gave me a career that I could never have imagined for myself, and I loved every minute of it." These two migrant women were to become leading contributors to New Zealand art and culture, and were revolutionary in their approach. Marty captured raw evidence documenting New Zealand life and history. Louise captured an abstraction of New Zealand life and they were both free spirits who came from opposite backgrounds, but their personal circumstances enabled them to grow and follow a path of immense productivity, leaving a legacy of creative wealth for the New Zealand public. Daunted and bored by the dullness of New Zealand and with the need to re-engage with the more sophisticated world that they knew, they both returned to their home countries alone for a period to gather some inspiration and load upon the vibrance of Europe. These trips were essential in their development as people and artists. In Louise's case, it gave her the formal training she needed to evolve. And for Marty, it helped her regain her confidence as a person to move forward. There are other parallels in their life and growth, including time spent in the Middle East and the work that came out of that. Although working in different genres, these women shared so much in common as immigrants from energetic and exciting cities, having to make their way in a conservative country that at the time was a backwater, and as Marty described it, as being devoid of people. They didn't give up, they didn't turn away, and I am sure at times they would have wanted to. Instead, they took on New Zealand with what could only be described as enthusiasm and passion, fulfilling their ambitions and their life. In the 2004 documentary, The Passionate Eye, I think Marty Friedlander sums up the experience of both women when she said, "It really began as the response of a stranger in a strange land and became for me a lifetime passion." Thank you for listening.